Welcome back. So now we're going to talk about the arguments used to justify trade protectionism. If the gains from free trade outweigh the losses and the losses from trade protectionism outweigh the gains, why is it still politically feasible to engage in trade protectionism all the time? So there are some legitimate and some less than legitimate arguments to protect domestic producers against foreign trade. One of the more legitimate ones is national security. It makes sense that we wouldn't want to outsource all of our military goods. We might want to keep that production in-house even if we don't have the comparative advantage necessarily. One can imagine a problem if Russia were the comparative advantage in nuclear weapons. Oil, steel, defense, food. There's a lot of goods that are sort of essential to the security of a nation. So there have been many different industries that have argued that they are essential to national security. Difficulty is figuring out exactly which ones are essential and which ones are less than essential. So although this argument is a good one, in practice it's difficult to figure out exactly where to draw the line. One of the less than legitimate arguments is that domestic employment, right? We're going to lose jobs with trade protectionism, and this is absolutely true. However, as we've looked at, the gains from trade outweigh the losses. So people that make this argument are forgetting about the gains from free trade. The gains to jobs, the gains in increased standard of living for consumers who now get a lower priced good from free trade, and on and on. However, we don't want to minimize this point, which is that it is disruptive for when free trade changes jobs, changes the mix of jobs. Absolutely, we have disruption and we have real pain and economic costs for families. And so economists argue generally that we should embrace free trade, but also help transition workers that are affected by free trade. The infant industry argument is also an interesting one. In this argument, new industries need time to grow. If you remember the discussion of increasing returns to scale and how some countries develop comparative advantage simply by being big enough, because they house an industry that happens to get more efficient as it grows, like automobiles or aircraft. This argument here is that the U.S. does not currently have comparative advantage in a product, but given time and protection to grow to scale, we could. So this is an argument for domestic protection against foreign competition under the guise of efficiency. Again, not a bad argument, but the problem is in practice figuring out which specific industries would be most appropriate to apply this to. And finally, let's remember the incentive for an industry to gain efficiency is not protection from competition. So in the long run, we have to wonder if efficiency really is developed when you protect against competition. Because indefinite protection from competition proves just to create that sort of inertia and laziness that happens often when monopolies are allowed to be prevented from competing against anybody else for a very long time. And of course, when you think about how politics often goes down, it is politics which often determines which industries are granted protection rather than the economics. So clever arguments, clever lobbyists can oftentimes make this argument, or a politician that already wanted to protect his or her constituents' jobs or had a pet industry that they wanted to develop might use this argument when it's actually more appropriate for something else. So again, overall the argument is a sound one. It's in the practice where the rubber meets the road that the problems happen. So this is not a right or wrong answer, but this is a question for you to check in with yourself. Which argument against trade is the strongest in your opinion? And finally, it may seem more and more clear as you get older that these arguments for trade protection are often political, and they're often not well grounded in economics. So, acknowledging that most countries have democracies and politicians, policymakers, who are prone to protect against free trade, even at the expense of their own country's economic self-interest overall, we have developed, or the world has developed, a network, messy at times, but a network of international trade agreements and trade treaties that aim to sort of tone down the protectionism around the world. So international trade agreements are treaties in which a country promises to reduce import tariffs in return for a promise by another country to do the same. So they're holding each other accountable, even though their domestic politics may argue otherwise, holding each other accountable to reducing trade barriers. For the U.S., an important one for us, perhaps the most important one, is NAFTA, between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. The European Union is a trade agreement that goes further. They also have a common currency and other alignment. And so the European Union is another trade agreement, but it's a regional trade agreement. There's global trade agreements, which have an even larger umbrella. The World Trade Organization is the most important one here. So the US, for instance, and the EU are part of their own regional trade agreements, but they're also part of the World Trade Organization. So countries that sign on to the World Trade Organization have agreed to, in theory, hold themselves to rounds of talks with each other to work on reducing trade barriers. Its existence is exactly about improving world trade by reducing trade barriers. And here's a practice question for you. This one does have a right and wrong answer. So feel free to pause. And here comes the right answer. That's all for now. Hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.